Welcome. Today we would be talking about conservation of biodiversity. We would be talking about two important types of concepts. One is the in-situ and the ex-situ conservation. The other is the topological and the non-topological conservation. So make in mind that these two are different terms and you must be very clear about understanding these concepts. Now first of all, why do we require conservation and what are the strategies for conservation? So strategies, as we said, could be either topological, non-topological approach. The strategies could be in-situ, ex-situ. But before that, why do we need to conserve? We need to conserve in order to preserve the gene, in order to preserve the generations. So that's one of the basic requirements. Then we need to support the ecosystem. Once the ecosystem is supported, it would bring in more of issues related to pollution that would be resolved. It would bring in public awareness among the people, and all of these would help to protect the wildlife, both the flora and the fauna. So be it the animals or the plants, both of those would be protected. Now in India, what are the things that we have been doing so forward? So Dehradun, you have the Wildlife Institute of India. Then you have Bhopal with the IIFM, that's the Indian Institute of Forest Management. You have Salim Ali Center for Ornithology, that's specifically for the birds in Coimbatore, so on and so forth. So these are some of those important examples that we have mentioned. Now, first we will talk about in-situ and ex-situ in brief, and then as we move forward in this lecture, we will understand the concepts in detail. So, in means inside and ex means exit, so outside. So, that's the best way to remember. So, in means inside and ex means exit. So, you can remember it as outside. Now, what would happen? I have a kind of biodiversity here. In this biodiversity, you can see you have numerous plants, flowers, animals, and so on and so forth. You have human beings and so on. Now all of these, when they are kept within this environment or within this system, it is known as in-situ preservation. So they are kept in their natural surrounding. The only thing is that surrounding area is being restricted in some cases with the human activities. You have certain boundaries that are drawn, but more or less the animal, the flora, the fauna is not taken away from their main area of dwelling. However, in ex-situ conservation, what happens is, let's say I want to preserve this species of plant. So I take this plant out from this ecosystem and I try to preserve it separately. So this could be done by various means. There could be seed banks, tissue cultures, you could have cryopreservation, so on and so forth. So when I am taking this species out from its surrounding and then trying to conserve it or preserve it, we call it as ex-situ conservation. So a very fundamental difference, and many of the students are struck up here. So under in-situ we talk about national parks, we talk about sanctuaries, we talk about biosphere reserves. So all those come under the protected areas. Besides those protected areas, you have the biological hotspots, which are very important. India has around 4 of the biodiversity hotspots in the world, where we talk about nearly 13 biodiversity hotspots across the world. Ex-situ, as we said, it could be as gene banks, cryopreservation, seed banks. Then you have the botanical gardens, the zoological gardens, the zoos, the arboreums. So all those are ex-situ conservation. Besides these, there could be some sacred plants. For example, tulsi is worshipped in many of the households. Neem is worshipped, banyan tree is worshipped in some of the households. So all those trees are sacred trees and considered important. So what people do is they take them away from their natural dwelling and try to conserve it because of the sacred issues. So similarly, you have the Bishnois who try to protect the prosopis, and then you have the black bugs that are also protected by Bishnois. So those are certain sects or communities which are protecting their species or the species they worship in the external surrounding. So that's a kind of ex-situ conservation. Now coming on to a different term, that is topological and non-topological conservation. It's not that widely heard, but it's very important to understand and know the difference between topological topological and non-topological conservation. Now when we talk about topological conservation, the key idea is a kind of hierarchy. In the ecosystem, we see each and every animal or organism is related to another organism. So you have frogs. Now the snakes would depend on the population of frogs, and so on and so forth. So there is interlinking that exists. Now before understanding this interlinking, let's understand in simple terms the meaning of the word topology. So topology basically talks about the structure or the shape of the network. Now this network could be of various forms. This network could be due to life forms. This network could be due to age. Now what are the factors that are considered under a topological conservation? Under topological conservation, we talk about a network that is drawn by energy or material, transfer of energy or transfer of material. So let's say you have species A, you have two dependent species B. Now from B you have further two dependent species on each, that's C. And from C you have further species that are dependent, that's D. Now what would happen if I remove any of this? Let's say I remove the species D, species C would be affected. If species C is affected, B would be affected. If B is affected, A would be affected. So that's a kind of topological conservation. So rather than conserving just the species A or just the species D, I try to conserve this whole topology of species that is given. Now as we said, under topological we talk about transfer of energy. So this could be either transfer of energy, this could be transfer of material, this could be population size of animals or organisms, be it the flora or the fauna, the plants or the animals. The population size is another important factor, and then the most important factor is fitness, whether that organism, the flora or the fauna, is fit with its surrounding or not. Now all these have a kind of interlinking. Now what these interlinking networks could be? There could be three kinds of interlinking networks that could be seen. So these networks could be, first, competition network. Second, you have mutualistic network. And third is consumption network. Let's understand each of these one by one. So under competition network, we say there are competing species. So you would have survival of the fittest as given by Darwin, that would exist. Under mutualistic, there is a kind of positive, a kind of symbiotic relationship where one species benefits the other species and so on and so forth. So you have two species that exist simultaneously, one benefiting the another and another benefiting the first. And finally you have a consumption based network. Now this consumption based network typically talks about the food web, what we commonly discuss. So snake eats the frog. So you have, if you want to preserve the population of snakes, you must preserve frogs in that area, and then only you could have snakes that could be preserved in that area. And therefore we understand these networks under topological conservation as three heads. That's the competitive network, the mutualistic network, and finally the consumption based network. Coming on to the non-topological. Now from the name itself it's clear, since we understand the topological network which talks about the structure and the network of the structure, non-topological talks about isolation. So be it any species, let's say if I am focusing on frogs, if I am focusing on snakes, be it any species that would be preserved independently. Now if we try to relate the topological and non-topological with in-situ and ex-situ, under ex-situ I can easily say ex-situ is a kind of non-topological conservation, because in ex-situ we do not maintain a chain. So let's say if you have a botanical garden, a zoological garden, you would have one species, two species of camel, one of elephant, one of turtle that would be kept in the zoological garden, but there is not a kind of interlinking that's usually maintained. It could be in extreme cases where they try to do it or try to produce it artificially, but in normal conditions these ex-situ conservations do not have topological conservation. So ex-situ is primarily non-topological conservation. However, when it comes to in-situ conservation, it could be either a topological conservation where you are trying to, where the natural surrounding itself maintains a kind of hierarchy, or try to conserve one species for the benefit of the other and so on. But this in-situ conservation can also be non-topological in nature. So that's very important to understand. Now coming on to the details of the in-situ and the ex-situ conservation that we had previously talked about. As we said, under in-situ conservation, we try to protect the whole of the environment, or we protect the environment at all levels. So we try to protect all the species that are present there. So good example is hotspots. So hotspots, you have good endemism. That means those species are located in a particular area. So all these crocodiles present in a particular locality, particular area. Now in India, there are 4 major hotspots. The first is Western Ghats. The second is the Indo-Burma area, which is also known as the northeast region of India. Then you have Sundalands, that's the Nicobar Island, and finally the Himalayan region, where you have the dicot species that is popular. Now in Western Ghats, Agastyamalaya Hills, Silent Valley and Amanbalam Reserve, those are the popular ones. In Indo-Burma, most of the northeast India, you have angiosperms. Sundaland, you have mainly the vegetation and the rare animals that are seen, and in Himalaya, mainly the dicot species that are seen. Now there are 4 factors that affect these hotspots. First is the degree of endemism. That means how specific that species is to a particular environment, and this species is found only in this environment and not in any other environment. So that is what is endemism. The next is degree of exploitation. How much it is open to the humanity and the level of threat to that organism. So level of threat and degradation and number of species, which is also known as species diversity, is considered under that. Now the next important is protected area. As we said, under protected area we have 3 important concepts: national parks, wildlife sanctuaries and biosphere reserve. So it's very important to understand the 3 and know the differences between the 3, where most of you are struck up, and this is very important for your multiple choice questions as well. Now national parks are the regions which are basically demarcated. So I have a kind of fixed boundary that's drawn for a national park. There is no hunting, no grazing and no forestry that is allowed in that area. So no grazing, no forestry and no cultivation that's allowed in this area. In India, only 1.1% of the area falls under national parks. However, when we talk about sanctuaries, that's a kind of open area with no boundaries. So it does not have a boundary. You can have unlimited kind of expansion that could be seen. Forestry is allowed, you have grazing that is allowed, you have cultivation that is allowed, and private ownership is also allowed, which is not allowed in this national park. So sanctuaries have a kind of private ownership that's allowed with no defined boundaries, and the animals are open in that area. However, the key aspect is the animals are not hunted. So hunting is the only thing that is restricted in that area, and here it's under the government control, so everything is protected and preserved. Next comes the biosphere reserve. Now biosphere is important because it occurs in 3 areas. You have the innermost as core, then you have the buffer, and finally you have the transitional zone. Now core is the area where there is no hunting, no human activity that is seen. In buffer area you have little human activity that is allowed, and in the transition area you have most of the human activities that are allowed. So this transitional area is also known as the outer belt. Good examples of national parks include Kaziranga, Kevladev, Manas. Then you have under sanctuaries, you have numerous sanctuaries across India. Biosphere reserves have been numerous. However, under UNESCO, India has 18 of the total biosphere reserves that stand to around 669 in 2016. Now, 4 of these important ones the 4 important biosphere reserves in India are Nanda Devi, Sundarbans in Bengal, then you have Nilgiris in Western Ghats, and then you have Gulf of Mannar. Now Gulf of Mannar is also part of the national park. So many of the regions have been classified both as national parks and biosphere reserves. So just take a note on that. Now the aim of all these protected areas is restoration of species, preserving the exotic species, resilience to the species, then conserving the species, monitoring, and the most important here is the research activities that is allowed specifically in the biosphere reserves. Now in India you had a program that was started, which was initially started worldwide in 1971 as MAB, Man and Biosphere Program, and in India it started in 1986. So the idea was understanding the interaction of human with the environment, the interference that could be caused, and the impact of animals, the strategies for the conservation. The next important topic that we would discuss today under the in-situ conservation is the wetlands. Now wetlands are low-lying marshy areas. So let's talk about Nal Sarovar. So that's a kind of wetland area. Now what is the benefit of this wetland area? Since they are low-lying marshy areas, they recharge the groundwater. So there is good amount of groundwater that is seen in these areas. Again, these protect from the frequent floodings that could be seen in the peripheral areas. Because of these wetlands, you have siltation and sedimentation that occurs on the periphery. You have numerous aquatic biota that could be seen, and it's again a home to numerous migratory birds, specifically when we talk about India. So you have the mangrove forests that are commonly seen in the wetlands. Now freshwater wetlands occur over land, and salt water occur over estuaries, and mangroves are also seen there. So freshwater wetlands usually occur only over land. That's important. Now as we talked about some of the sacred trees, so Bishnois worship prosopis, then you have black buck animals that are worshipped by Bishnois. Similarly in Sikkim, you have aquatic sacred areas that are seen, which is known as Khichropalli. Then you have temples that have been built by tribals in the Devdar forest in Kumaon, Jaintia and Khasi in Meghalaya. These are the tribes, and they are preserving in these hills itself. So Jaintia and Khasi are the hills as well. Then you have Sarguja, Chandan and Bastar areas in Chhattisgarh, and you have Aravlis in Rajasthan, where you have sacred forests that are kept up. Now we talked about in-situ. Let's move on to the ex-situ. Now as we said, under ex-situ you have the off-site collection that is seen. So botanical garden or zoological gardens, what they do, rather than preserving the trees, the animals in their natural surrounding, they preserve it outside. So there are more than 1500 botanical gardens and 800 zoological gardens. Numerous of those have captive breeding programs. So species which have very less number of individuals are worked out under the captive breeding program to increase the number, to restock them. Then you have gene banks, very important, to make the gene viable. Now again you have recalcitrant genes. Recalcitrant genes are those, or seeds are those, which cannot adopt to excessive moisture conditions. So what is done for this is, there is a kind of, these are killed if the moisture is reduced. For example, jackfruit, tea, coconut, all these seeds, if there is very less moisture, or the moisture level decreases suddenly, or the temperature decreases suddenly, these are killed. So what has happened under the gene banks or the seed banks is, these seeds are preserved. Specifically the recalcitrant seeds. Besides that, you have the orthodox seeds. Orthodox seeds are the seeds which can tolerate reduction in the moisture. They can tolerate low temperature for a long period. Again you have orchids. Those are the plants with recalcitrant seeds, so which cannot tolerate a reduction in temperature or moisture conditions. Then you have tissue culture, you have callus, embroid, pollen grain culture. So all those are other ways. And the last is cryopreservation. Cryopreservation is preserving a species at a temperature of minus 196 degrees Celsius using liquid nitrogen. So what happens is, let's say I have a species of this organism, and this is preserved in cryopreservation. Now this species, initially when this species was available, the temperature of this atmosphere, let's say, was around 30 degrees Celsius. Now I have kept this in cryopreservation. I want after 10 years to bring this species back and see whether it survives or not. Now after 10 years the situation has changed. What has happened is the temperature of this region has dropped from 30 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius. Now this species, which was under cryopreservation, has been brought out, and what basically happens is it is not able to survive because it is not able to adapt to the changes that have taken in the climate during this time period. So under cryopreservation, one major limitation is that the species is definitely kept, but when it comes to life back after a period or after a certain time period, it's not sure that it would be able to adapt to the climatic changes that have taken place during that time. So that's very, very important to understand under cryopreservation. Now when we talk about international efforts, you have the Earth Summit, you have numerous environmental conventions. We have already covered those in the following videos, so you can refer that. You have the role of IUCN and the other Greenpeace organizations, WWF and so on. Now if we talk about conservation in India particularly, the In-Situ Conservation in India is managed by Ministry of Environment and Forest. Then you have the joint forest management that is practiced in India. Ex-Situ management, the Ex-Situ Conservation is managed by National Bureau of Plants, Animals and Fishes, Genetic Resources. So those are the two different organizations looking for In-Situ Conservation and Ex-Situ Conservation in India. 3rd December is considered as the World Conservation Day and 29th December as the Biological Diversity Day. So those are some of the general facts that are important for this lecture. However, in summary, we talked about what is in-situ conservation, ex-situ conservation, the differences from the topological and the non-topological conservation, and we would be covering further lectures on biodiversity, food chain, food web, ecosystems in the upcoming classes. So definitely stay tuned. If you have any doubts, any queries, leave those as comment below the video. We'll be more than happy to resolve those. Have a very good day ahead.